Hello everyone, before we get going I just want to quickly announce that my Discord server is now open to the public, discord.gg/SFO. I'll describe more at the end of the video, but click on the link in the description and I'll see you there. A few weeks back, I made that video about liberalism's great flaw, where Sargon and James Lindsay were feuding over some philosophy stuff. I started it by describing a specific problem with airports. Let's take another look at that story. The New York Times published an article titled "The End of the All-Male, All-White Cockpit," and Andrew Wilco replied with, "Can't we just hire the best person for the job?" To anybody who grew up in a Western country, this is a reasonable question to ask. Why do we care if an airplane is staffed entirely by black women, or white men, or disabled fat transbians, or whatever else? Shouldn't the criteria that we're looking for be if they can do the job they're hired to do? Isn't that the whole point of MLK's desire to be judged by the content of their character and not the color of their skin? When a true liberal, not a progressive, looks at this article, he objects. Not because he's a racist or a sexist. The identity of the person doing the job is morally inconsequential. But because the most important criteria is not diversity, it's competency. This video today is about explaining an idea common on the dissident right. It's not an idea that I fully agree with, though it does have some limited use as an analytical lens in some places. But more importantly, it's an idea from modern right-wing philosophy that seems to really motivate rightists at the moment. And in my experience, it's an idea that is pretty unknown by most leftists and a lot of centrists. This list was posted a few months ago on a dissident right Twitter account that I keep tabs on. It's a list of dissident right talking points. And in my experience, while the broader left tends to disagree with all of these things, they do so without understanding the right's formulation of them. The one that we're talking about today is the competency crisis. So, what's the competency crisis? Well, the name gives away a lot right out the gate. A lack of competency leading to a crisis. Let's return to that all-black, all-female airplane cockpit. A bunch of news stories all hit the mainstream at the same time, regarding the new diversity of the airline industry. And from the outside, you'd be forgiven for believing that the various news organizations coordinated their coverage. Within like the same 3-week period, we saw all of this shit go viral. Ads promoting diverse airplane crews, news articles praising the achievements of diverse pilots, TikToks where diverse airline crews dance like those COVID-era nurses dancing. Probably the craziest headline that I personally read at this time was where the FAA announced a diversity push focusing on hiring people with severe disabilities. I'm sure they didn't mean actually having a retard fly the plane, but that's certainly how everyone took it. While all of these articles were coming out, in right-wing spaces, another set of stories were also going viral. Stories of planes crashing, stories of planes suffering damage mid-flight, stories of planes being grounded because passengers saw a problem with them. Not anyone who's actually on the job, but the passenger looking out the window before takeoff. Videos of airplane accidents were reposted, with the diversity articles attached to them, in order to make fun of the whole thing. And then there was that one recording of a woman working in an airport tower, arguing with a man who's flying a plane over how he should be flying.
You should have turned to your base before you hit the approach end of the runway. You're outside the airport traffic area.
We're on about a quarter-mile final, ma'am. Base.
Yeah, no, you should be inside the airport. You should have turned your base up even the numbers.
We can't do that and land on the 1,000-footers.
Well, that's what a short approach is.
I'm sorry, I guess we need to come up with something different because in order to complete a commercial check ride, we've got to do what's called a power-off 180.
That's fine, but don't ask for a short approach if you're going to do a power-off 180. That's my point.
Maybe we need to talk about that some more because you're the first controller in 15 years that's ever said that.
Well, if you're doing something other than a short approach, don't ask for a short approach.
Well, I will definitely look up the definition of short approach because I've never seen where it says you turn base abeam the numbers because I don't see how you could possibly do that.
Well, I Googled it, actually. I Googled short approach, and it said to turn your base abeam or before the numbers, and you will land probably touchdown around midfield.
Yeah, she literally just told the pilot, the guy whose job it is to fly the plane, that she Googled it and he's wrong. Okay. And just for good measure, some noted anti-trans accounts got in on the fun, exposing a few random dudes in dresses who work as flight attendants, seemingly for fetish reasons, while claiming that they're trans. This culminated with libs of TikTok exposing the CEO of United Airlines for moonlighting as a drag queen. That very same CEO went on record discussing his company's diversity initiatives.
We have committed that 50% of the classes will be women or people of color. Today, only 19% of our pilots at United Airlines are women or people of color. And by the way, from all the data I've seen, that's the highest of any airline in the country.
white males don't just dominate in the cockpits, also in the C-suite at United Airlines.
Well, look, at United, I'm proud of the diversity that we actually have in our C-suite. I think if you look around corporate America...
Correct me if I'm saying, though, so this was just based off your website, the people you list as executives, but out of 11 people, 3 are women. I believe 1 is a person of color.
That's correct. But, you know, in corporate America, I think, you know...
That's a low bar. How do you raise your own bar?
Well, a lot of this is, you know, focusing on it. We have programs to, one of the things we do is for every job when we do an interview, we require women and people of color to be involved in the interview process, bringing people in early in their careers as well.
And if you want to tie a bow on this narrative, cap the whole thing off with an article talking about how safe airplane crashes are nowadays. I want to make it very clear that whatever accidents you see, that's obviously not all airlines. The reason that video of the one plane with a flaming wing was reposted like 1,000 times is because there's not actually that many planes with flaming wings. But the video is so dramatic, it's hard to get out of your head, you know? And that's the general idea behind this entire news cycle and the right wing's interpretation of it. There is something going on here, obviously, but it's probably not as bad as it seems at first glance. These stories all made the rounds in the same circles at the same time because that's what the people looking at them wanted to see. It may have been the case that the various news outlets colluded to release roughly the same pro-diversity article at around the same time, but that was just red meat to the rightoids, who all began pushing their interpretation of events at the same time as well. At the point of me publishing this video, the news cycle has mostly moved on. No one's talking about the airplane thing anymore. But for a couple of weeks, this was the big story in right-wing spaces. And their attitude is best summed up by this short comedy clip, where videos of dancing pilots and pride parades on the plane are interspersed with engines blowing up and people dying. To sum it all up, there's something bad going on here, sure, but I don't think it's as serious as most right-wingers think it is. And the reason they think it's that serious is because of a bunch of stories getting picked up at the same time, and their own reply to those stories amplifying them until it turned into a self-sustaining spin cycle. Around this time, Elon Musk posted the following: "Competence must prevail over racism and sexism because it is both morally right and essential to a better future," with a link to an article titled "Complex Systems Won't Survive the Competence Crisis." Let's read a bit of that article. At a casual glance, the recent cascades of American disasters might seem unrelated. In a span of fewer than 6 months in 2017, 3 U.S. naval warships experienced 3 separate collisions, resulting in 17 deaths. A year later, power lines owned by PG&E started a wildfire that killed 85 people. The pipeline carrying almost half of the East Coast gasoline shut down due to a ransomware attack. Almost 500,000 intermodal containers sat on cargo ships and able to dock at Los Angeles ports. A train carrying thousands of tons of hazardous and flammable chemicals derailed near East Palestine, Ohio. Air traffic control cleared a FedEx plane to land on a runway occupied by a Southwest plane preparing for takeoff. Eye drops contaminated with antibiotic-resistant bacteria killed 4 and blinded 14. While disasters like these are often front-page news, the broader connection between the disasters barely elicits any mention. America must be understood as a series of interwoven systems. The healthcare system sends a bill to a patient using the postal system, and the patient uses a mobile phone system to pay the bill with a credit card issued by the banking system. All of these systems must be assumed to work for anyone to make even simple decisions. But the failure of one system has cascading consequences for all of the adjacent systems. As a consequence of escalating rates of failure, America's complex systems are slowly collapsing. The core issue is that changing political mores have established the systematic promotion of the unqualified and the sidelining of the competent. This has continually weakened our society's ability to manage modern systems. At its inception, it represented a break from the trend of the 1920s to the 1960s, when the direct meritocratic evaluation of competence became the norm across vast swaths of American society. This is the thesis of the competency crisis, or as they call it here, the competence crisis. Same thing. As we shifted focus away from hiring the best people for a job and toward hiring the most diverse person for a job, complex systems that required expertise began to break down. The article lays out a compelling argument for this position, but is it true? In order to dig into that question, I have to explain a few things that I already covered in a previous video. The one about a conversation I had with Sargon and Adam and Sitch on meritocracy. But frankly, that video had some serious problems. So let's just quickly go over the basic facts. Aristocracy comes from the Greek aristos, meaning the best, and kratos, meaning power. Directly translated, it means rule by the best. Aristocracy, in practice, refers to a hereditary ruling class, chosen not by their ability to rule, but by their birthright. A prince becomes a king because his dad was king. Contrast that with meritocracy. Kratos is still Greek for power, but the first half of the word comes from the Latin merio, meaning to deserve. Directly translated, meritocracy means rule by the most deserving. Meritocracy in practice refers to a ruling class of people who earn their position as elites based on their abilities rather than their birthright. It's important to note that despite the American objection to the concept of aristocracy, there is significant overlap between these positions, which should be unsurprising since rule by the best and rule by the most deserving are pretty much the same thing linguistically. Though noble families are aristocratic institutions, most of them got their start by some ancestor being competent at their job, the job generally being warfare, and then that power being passed down through their family like it was their private property. The conventional wisdom of the aristocratic position is that if talent is at least partially genetic, then a talented parent is more likely to produce a talented child. Combine that with the extra resources that comes with being an elite, and it seems like aristocrats are also meritocrats, at least on paper anyway. In practice, though, the more meritocratic countries, like our modern Western liberal capitalist democracies, have created the space for new elites to generate out of the lower class based on their own talents, regardless of their family name or their wealth. And generally, our countries tend to be better off because the best and brightest aren't nearly as restrained by their social class. That being said, even new elites can still establish family dynasties. And this is why, for example, the American upper class is a combination of well-known family names like Clinton, Bush, or Trump, alongside self-made men like Gates, Jobs, or Bezos. But while the four of us were discussing aristocracy and meritocracy on that stream, there was a third system sneaking up behind us, ready to clobber us in the back of the head and make off with the spoils. Its name is kakistocracy, and it's the Greek inversion of aristocracy, where aristos means the best, kakistos means the worst. Kakistocracy, therefore, literally translates to rule of the worst. At face value, the idea just seems retarded. Like, who the fuck would ever set up a political system where the worst people are the ruling class? It makes no real sense. But after you sit down and think for a bit, there actually is some real meat on the bone here. For starters, we already know about what we call the negative selection problem in politics. Negative selection is where somebody in a position of authority will choose the most competent subordinates to work for him as long as they're not more competent than he is, as he wants to remain in his position. And raising up a possible competitor for his position directly threatens his own interest. In other words, if you're competent but you're in a low position on the hierarchy, your climbing of the hierarchy represents a threat to those who are already at the top, and so it's in their best interest to stop you. This happens all the time in dictatorships, but it also does happen somewhat in democracies as well. This idea was reformulated as the Peter Principle by Lawrence J. Peter in 1969. His thesis is that people who aren't incompetent, but aren't supremely competent, just random normal people who are somewhat competent, they tend to be promoted to the limits of their competency in an organization. The final level they find themselves promoted up to is called the Peter Plateau. They've reached the limit of their ability to move upwards, and their final position tends to be one where they are just slightly incompetent at their job. Therefore, given enough time, all positions in any hierarchy inevitably become filled with incompetent people. Both of these ideas have been studied extensively, and they seem to have at least some validity. There are obviously corrupt hierarchies where only power matters, and there are also obviously more competent hierarchies that become corrupt over time due to bad actors. But there also seems to be an invisible hand that slowly tilts even a good hierarchy towards corruption all on its own, simply due to the individuals in the hierarchy acting in their own decentralized interests. It's for this reason that you can find many a communist online stating that hierarchies are all inherently oppressive and they must be dismantled, or that meritocracy is a myth, it can't exist. The interpretation for that second one falls on a 50-50 split, where they either mean that differences in merit always create a new aristocratic class, which is sort of true but not necessary, or that no differences in merit actually exist between individuals. It's all simply a product of class oppression, which is fucking unhinged. And in any case, the communist solution to this problem is to burn it all down, which leaves us in a far worse position than we were. But okay, kakistocracy, rule by the worst. We now have some framework describing its existence. But why would anybody ever actually want that? Well, that brings us to the final piece of the puzzle today. I read the book The Life of Lenin a couple years ago, which is, drumroll please, the biography of Vladimir Lenin. Who would have thought? Unlike Stalin, who was entirely self-interested and simply used the Soviet system he inherited for his own personal gain, Lenin was ideologically devoted to the revolutionary cause. This doesn't necessarily make him better than Stalin, by the way. They both still killed millions. But if Stalin is on one end of the grifter ideologue spectrum, Lenin is on the other. Lenin was intelligent, ruthless, politically astute, extremely disciplined, and most importantly of all, a completely determined communist zealot. If you're right-leaning, you probably know about Robert Conquest's 3 laws of politics. They read, 1. Everyone is conservative about what he knows best. 2. Any organization not explicitly right-wing sooner or later becomes left-wing. 3. The simplest way to explain the behavior of any bureaucratic organization is to assume that it's controlled by a cabal of its enemies. I personally don't put too much stock in the third law, but the first one seems to just be true. while the second one seems to be true enough that a pattern has emerged. I've even seen many left-leaning people remark on the second one as if it were just self-evident. Like, obviously things just naturally move leftward over time, duh. For the socialists, this is explained by Marx's historical materialism, that it's material conditions on the ground, not philosophy or ideology, that drives history's advance. And therefore, it would always drift leftward because the moneyless, stateless, classless society of communism is the inevitable endpoint of human development. In the Marxist view, anyway. There's a similar idea for liberals and progressives. This is called Whig history, which I've talked about before. That philosophical and political and economic progress naturally comes along with scientific progress. In simple terms, this is what MLK meant when he said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." In both of these views, what progress is simply a slow but unending march leftward, where the more left you are, the more progressed or advanced you are, and also that this advancement is morally superior to past developments. Most importantly of all, this process is viewed as natural. It happens this way because it's inevitable, as if it were some scientific process. This is a position that most of the left holds, and also a good chunk of the right holds it too, which has to be a weird headspace to be in, frankly. I can't imagine being right-wing and also accepting an idea that says you are inherently doomed, prophesized to fail right from the get-go. Maybe that's where a lot of the apocalypticism on the right wing comes from, I don't know. What I do know is, after reading the life of Lenin, I've come to the position that this perceived inevitability of Robert Conquest's second law is bullshit, and I'll tell you why. We all know that Stalin suppressed gays and racial minorities and basically created a caste system with straight ethnic Russians at the top. It's one of the reasons that the libertarian socialists tend to call the tankies red fascists, because from their point of view, they were fascists who adopted socialist aesthetics. But Lenin actually did the opposite. Lenin cobbled together not only a faction of the lower classes, workers and serfs, but also of various outsiders in Tsarist Russia. Gays, Jews, Latvians, Ukrainians, women, atheists, anybody who was an oppressed class that had a bone to pick with the old Russian aristocracy, Lenin got them on side. And with this coalition of low-status people, Lenin violently exterminated the Russian aristocracy. If you've read anything about human psychology, you'd know that we have a natural tendency towards hierarchy. This is the whole Jordan Peterson lobster thing. We've got structures in our brain that are evolutionarily millions of years old, that allow us to judge who is the top dog in a social situation. Mechanisms that are probably necessary as a social species. When we perceive ourselves as increasing in status, due to a financial windfall or a professional victory or attracting a mate, we feel better about ourselves. When we perceive ourselves as decreasing in status, due to a loss or a failure or a rejection, we feel worse about ourselves. It's more than simply missing out on something in a material sense, though that's part of it. It's also that reality is giving you feedback, both positive and negative, about your behavior. What socialism sells to lower class people, not directly, it's not in the text, but what it sells on a psychological level is status. And when you perceive your status falling, socialism becomes a very tempting offer. This effect is actually independent of whether or not the working class's status is actually falling. For example, the Industrial Revolution had actually improved the lives of many workers, if only marginally, but almost none of them perceived it as such, so a lot of them became socialists. In fact, anytime socialist thinking is on the rise in a given society, it's because the workers of that society perceive their status as getting worse, whether or not it actually is. Perhaps most importantly of all, in my opinion anyway, is that when socialism promises working class people status, on a psychological level that promise is so attractive because those people know, deep in their hearts, they don't deserve that status. Let me give you an example. In 1918, Lenin sanctioned the creation of a committee of poor peasants in each Russian village. The name is shortened to combeds in Russian. The combeds were established to solve a food shortage in Russian cities. Local village governments weren't providing the cities with enough food, and the Bolsheviks believed the problem was that the village governments were dominated by local wealthy players who were in opposition to the socialist project. The Bolsheviks conceptualized a three-tier system to divide up the Russian peasants living in the countryside. The bednyaks were poor peasants, the ones who had to sell their labor to survive. The serednyaks were landowners who farmed their own land with their own labor. They were the middle peasants. And the kulaks, the wealthy peasants, they owned farmland and hired the bednyaks. Now, in a Marxian sense, the kulaks weren't bourgeois. They didn't simply sit back and provide no labor and rake in profit by virtue of ownership. The kulaks didn't perform as much physical labor as the workers they hired, though they did do some. But more importantly, they also organized the whole project, and they transported and sold the food at market. This is still necessary labor, even if it's not the labor of actually physically gathering the produce. Even today, some communists reject the idea that management is real labor, because it's not actually directly doing the job. But anybody who's ever worked on any project involving more than a few people pretty quickly figures out that delegation and direction is necessary work. The historian Robert Davies wrote that kulak referred to a class of people who were, one generation ago, serfs under the Russian Tsar, but had become small landowners due to the Stolpin land reforms of 1906. These reforms under Prime Minister Stolpin during the final years of the Russian Empire were meant to de-radicalize the countryside peasantry away from socialism. And this actually worked. The revolution came from Lenin, who wrote political theory while in exile, with the express purpose of agitating a revolution, and the vanguard of urban socialist intellectuals he cultivated back in the Russian cities. It didn't come from the actual working class. The Stolpin reforms did a lot of stuff. They improved education, they began industrialization and agriculture, but most importantly for this topic, they greatly expanded the peasant land bank. The Peasant Land Bank was established in 1885 with the intention of helping peasants purchase their own farmland, but it was largely ineffective until the Stolpin reforms. After 1906, peasants were given the right to buy the land their families had previously worked as serfs, and the Peasant Land Bank provided an affordable line of credit for this purpose. Almost 50% of the Russian Empire's marketable grain came from these farms, reflecting the program's widespread success. The most successful people under these programs were the ones who ended up having enough success to hire on extra hands and expand their farms, making them the kulaks. Let's return to our friend Robert Conquest again. Specifically, his book, The Harvest of Sorrow, this time. Conquest outlines that the term kulak rapidly became politically useful, and the definition of who exactly was a kulak wasn't clear-cut. Lenin famously called them bloodsuckers, vampires, plunderers of the people, and profiteers, who fattened themselves during famines. But the definition of kulak drifted from peasant who hires other peasants, to peasant who has more than 20 hectares of land, to peasant who owns livestock. In some instances, the definition of kulak simply became peasant who has a bit too much compared to his neighbors. I want to impress upon you that these were peasants. They weren't the 1% or anything like that. These are people whose parents had been serfs, who were given an opportunity under Stolpin, and who were lucky enough, or unlucky enough depending how you look at it, to be the most successful farmers in their area. So, by June 11th of 1918, the creation of the combeds was authorized. The combeds were primarily staffed by a village's bednyaks, the poor peasants, with the support of a Red Army detachment from the Congress of Soviets. They were tasked with locating and confiscating surplus grain from the other peasants in the village. They were also in charge of the distribution of food, tools, and other commodities. Sometimes a village would fail to create a combed. Even the bednyaks didn't want to cooperate. Other times, a village would create a combed where all members of the village were allowed to participate. In these instances, the villagers didn't self-identify as proletarians, and they viewed the Bolshevik attempt to divide their community with suspicion. In these cases, the resulting combed was entirely staffed by outsiders, and behaved like an occupying foreign army, extracting everything of value from the community without any real regard for the peasantry. But, most of the time, a village's bednyaks did actually cooperate with the process. Here's how it played out. The first people the Red Army would hit up were the drunks and the rejects of whatever small town they had stopped in. These were the people at the very bottom of the local hierarchy, partially for reasons out of their control, like their crops didn't work out or something, and partially for reasons entirely in their control, like they decided to stew in their failure and become bitter towards the more upstanding members of their community. The revolutionaries then told these people that it wasn't their fault their life sucked. Those upstanding neighbors were oppressing them actually, and that if they joined the cause, they'd have the opportunity to exact some proletarian revenge. They then gave the drunks guns and uniforms and let them go to town. To put it plainly, a lot of the revolutionary violence of the bednyaks was actually fueled by bitterness at their own failure, and a desire to gain status despite that failure. As a result, by August of 1918, Lenin's government faced a peasant uprising in the countryside. In response, Lenin issued his famous hanging order, which read, "Comrades, the insurrection of 5 kulak districts should be pitilessly suppressed. The interests of the whole revolution require this, because the last decisive battle with the kulaks is now underway everywhere. An example must be made. 1. Absolutely hang, in full view of the people, no fewer than 100 known kulaks, fat cats, bloodsuckers. 2. Publish their names. 3. Seize all of their grain. 4. Designate hostages. Do it in such a fashion that for hundreds of kilometers, the people see, tremble, know, shout. The blood-sucking kulaks are being strangled and will be strangled." By the fall of 1918, the combeds were abolished, and their authority of requisition was transferred back to the local village government. But despite lasting less than a year, they had done their job. The village governments were no longer dominated by local wealthy individuals. Those people were either no longer wealthy or no longer present. The bednyaks who worked to requisition grain and suppress resistance in the combeds found themselves doing pretty much the exact same job in the local government. In a more meritocratic society, the elites are the people with the most ability. Their skills or their work ethic or whatever allows them to rise to the top. In an aristocracy, it's not guaranteed that the elites are competent, but considering that they have access to good education and nutrition and resources, it is going to be a safe bet that they're at least more competent than the average Joe. Either way, the elites of any given society tend to be at least somewhat competent people. Socialist revolutions generally don't rely on these elites, not only because the class interest of the elites don't align with the class interest of the workers, though that's certainly a factor, but also because the competency of elites allows them to be disloyal, and loyalty is the linchpin of any large organization. Sure, if you're an elite, you might catch a bullet to the head like the Russian Tsar did, but a lord's most competent bean counter during feudalism probably found himself as a businessman's most competent bean counter after the capitalists took over. The very top of the society is slated to be purged by the socialists, but a few rungs down the ladder of competence are the people that every society needs, no matter what ideology it follows. This is an effect that you've probably observed for yourself if you've ever worked in a very professional, high-paying industry. Yeah, the Marxist analysis of capitalist employment is that the boss inherently has leverage over the worker because the boss can simply find another worker while the worker must sell his labor or starve. But that lens breaks as you move upward into highly specialized fields. The reason that companies at high levels pay out the ass for things like non-compete clauses, or why poaching high-skill workers from other companies even exists, is because at these levels, individual workers actually have ridiculous amounts of leverage over a business. The highly skilled worker does not need to be loyal to one organization. His superior abilities allow him to hit the ground running at so much as a whiff of trouble. The point I'm making is that the elites of any society don't have a reason to be loyal to any one political regime. In fact, it's in their interest to jump ship the minute the wind appears to be turning. This is why Lenin built his coalition not out of the elites of Russian society, but out of the rejects of Russian society. The people who were true followers of Lenin, the ones who put him into power, they knew deep down that their status had improved, that the improvement came about through violence against the oppressor, and that everything they had, they owed to the Bolsheviks. This is why the backbone of the combeds wasn't the most competent peasants in the community, but instead the least competent, because going from a drunk loser to a low-level commissar was an increase in status. And it came with the power to go down the road to that neighbor they always envied, kick his door in, slit his throat, rape his wife, requisition everything he owned, and feel morally superior about doing it all, because his failure in life meant that he was being oppressed by the kulak. The lesson here is that while an elite can offer competence to a regime, an outsider can offer loyalty. And loyalty is far more important when it comes to the stability of an organization. Of course, we all know the downside to this approach. All of the competent people in Russia were eventually butchered, and the Soviet Union underwent a slow-motion collapse. But it took 75 years for that collapse to complete, and during that time, we got to witness for the first time in history the reign of the incompetent but fiercely loyal outsider. All of the most retarded shit you could ever imagine, Lysenkoism or whatever else, the Communist Party demanded it, and the loyal incompetents dutifully executed the orders. It wasn't just the Soviets either. Every socialist state so far has used Lenin's model of rule by incompetent loyalists. Chairman Mao would always repeat, "Never forget the class struggle," which was basically him saying, never forget that you used to be a peasant, and now you're a middle manager in the Communist Party, and it's all because of me. I'll return to Mencius Moldbug once again, because although I think his prescriptions are god-awful, his writing really is beautifully compact. Falsehood is a more effective organizing tool than the truth. Anyone can believe the truth. To believe in falsehood is an unforgeable demonstration of loyalty. There you go. He put everything I've been saying for the past 10 minutes into one sentence. If only I could write like that. Returning to Conquest's second law of politics, the reason that things drift leftward over time isn't because it's inevitable. It's not some moral arc of history that will naturally come to pass. It's because the material interest of the most competent people of any given society is not to be loyal to the current regime, because their competency will allow them to thrive anywhere. But it is in the material interest of the rejects of any given society to be loyal to a revolution against the current regime, as a way of artificially increasing their own status. In short, you can't run a tight, cohesive, loyal ruling coalition with competent people, not for any long period of time, because those people are naturally opportunists, not loyalists. And insofar as any leftist movement is a coalition of the fringes, of the low-status outsider, their class interest will always be tilted towards revolution and the creation of an incompetent Leninist coalition that is nonetheless loyal to the great leader that gave them the opportunity to rise above their station. The political realist would probably sum up the state of affairs with a simple axiom: a man is only as loyal as his options. All of this is, of course, to the long-term detriment of everyone. The competent people end up getting purged during the revolution, and after the revolution is over, you always get someone like Stalin who comes along to settle the internal incoherencies of the movement by purging the degenerates. What's important to us today is, this does kind of sound like our current left, doesn't it? Here's a quick example. Someone posted on Twitter the new Ukraine inclusive pride flag, where the Ukrainian blue and yellow was added to the chevron. And I replied to it with, can't wait for them to add the Palestinian colors too. Look at this fucking thing. It's got not only the gay symbols, but the intersex shit, and the trans shit, and the Black Lives Matter shit, and now the Ukraine shit. I replied to this by saying, keep going with it until you cover the entire rainbow and colonize the original point out of existence. And this is a symbolic representation of what I'm describing here. The current left wing of politics in the liberal capitalist democratic West is a gaggle of misfits, everyone who is on the bottom of the intersectional analysis. And these disparate groups don't quite fit together. And it's not just ethnic or sexual minorities. There's people who perform sexually unhealthy behaviors. There's drug users, mentally unwell or mentally deficient people, looters and abusers and rapists, sometimes even pedos. Their bad behavior doesn't really matter that much, as long as they don't get too out of hand and target their patrons with their misadventures. In the socialist revolutions of the old world, relying on ethnic outsiders was a risky gamble, because they had their own counterplay, nationalism. The various non-Russian ethnicities in the Soviet Union had a traditional claim to a homeland and a culture separate from Russia, which is why even though Lenin initially appealed to them, they had to eventually be suppressed. But in an all-immigrant nation like America, that's not really an issue, and ethnic outsiders can be brought into the gaggle of misfits pretty cleanly. I want to make it clear at this point that I don't actually fully believe in this theory myself. This theory is known on the dissident right as Bioleninism. The idea is that Lenin's original method of coalition building out of the various scraps of society has been adapted by modern socialist revolutionaries in the West. The theory states that the ignorant assistance of the Democratic Party in America, or the Labour Party in the UK, or the Liberal Party in Canada, or any other center-left party, is offered because they actually value diversity and inclusion rather than just paying lip service to those ideas. But the socialist subversives underneath agitate for these policies because they believe that the resulting lack of social cohesion will make a workers' revolution possible. And again, although I don't fully believe this idea, I have to admit, this mode of analysis does have some predictive power. For example, back in my university days, I remember learning about intersectionality and remarking that one day, Muslims are going to feud with gay and trans people, despite the left accepting them both through the intersectional analysis, and that this feud would cause the broader progressive movement to become ideologically paralyzed because it lacks any sort of mechanism to resolve its own internal contradictions. It took us over a decade, but we eventually got to that point. Another thing that I noticed while I was at university, and based on everything I've seen since then, it's not that different now, is how left-leaning the academic machine is. The obvious reply from the progressive is that the academy is the domain of the intellect, and obviously right-wingers are too stupid to qualify. That's probably partially true. There's a lot of sub-90 IQ rednecks out there, but there is a second explanation, again from the Bio-Leninist interpretation of this. Academics, journalists, HR department heads, they're all left-leaning because they are, in their own way, the rejects of capitalist society. The intelligent person who invents something useful or writes a successful book or whatever, the one who manages to get rich by his own innovations, he doesn't tend to lean left. But the intelligent person who, despite his intelligence, hasn't produced anything that other people in society value enough to buy, I would expect that sort of person to be pretty bitter. And that describes most of the literature, history, and gender studies professors that I met. Despite the fact that socialist movements, in practice, are not actually all that nice to intellectuals, I think that Western intellectuals tend to be socialists because they all had a mistaken belief that they should be able to skate by solely on the fact that they have a big brain. Not that they do anything with it, but that they just have it. And they all became disillusioned with society the minute they realized that's not how it works. When I did my video on Antonio Gramsci, I described his view of why a socialist revolution came to Russia, but not the more industrially advanced nations of Western Europe. Gramsci believed that in Russia, the ruling class did not have true cultural hegemony, and so they were easy to overthrow without subversion. But in the West, there was prosperity, there was a growing middle class, decent wages and jobs and benefits, for the time anyway. And so a socialist revolution would not naturally come as long as the workers were kept comfortable. Gramsci's solution was that the socialists had to subvert the institutions of cultural output first, in order to plant the seeds of working class revolution. Gramsci didn't live to see his theory put into practice, but it was eventually put into practice, precisely by those very intellectuals in positions of middle power across the various institutions of our society who were bitter about their own lack of success. The Gramscian promise was largely the same as the Leninist one psychologically, the promise of status to low-status people. But in America, there was no agitated proletariat to sculpt a revolution out of. The workers actually had it pretty good. All the hippies became today's boomers, and none of those guys have abolished private property or anything like that. The reason for this is because the West is so materially prosperous that workers are no longer people with the lowest status in society anymore. Plumbers, construction workers, farmers, they all make good money. Dirty or dangerous jobs pay extremely well. The worst parts of work have been automated away. Even entry-level stuff like retail tends to come with a union and benefits nowadays, or at least a flexible schedule with as much time off as you'd like. No, the people with the lowest status in the West nowadays aren't workers, they're minorities. The reason it's called Bioleninism and not just Leninism is because the bio part implies that today's socialist subversives are significantly more interested in using racial and sexual minorities than Lenin himself ever was, making their new grouping a coalition of the biological fringes. But this movement doesn't have a leader, and without a Stalin-like figure to stop the ratchet and consolidate power, we have continued to drift ever leftward into fully insane territory at times, with absolutely nobody at the helm of the ship. And now, with the theory laid out, I will take us all the way back to the beginning. When the right wing sees diversity hires being lauded by journalists, while at the same time seeing the industry that they were hired for in the middle of seemingly a slow collapse, like the airlines for example, they're looking at the whole state of affairs through the lens of Bioleninism. They're seeing the competency crisis, where people are hired not based on merit, but based on diversity. Because the people who are doing the hiring are not hiring for merit, but they're hiring for loyalty. And that given enough time, this practice will lead to a social collapse, allowing for a revolution to begin. It's the right-wing view that progressives are simply useful idiots in this entire process, having their egalitarian morals twisted and used against them by the revolutionaries. Where a sensible liberal might value merit and would simply hire the best person for the job, a progressive values diversity and hires based on the candidate being a member of a marginalized group. No, really, that's actually what they do. For example, back in 2014, the FAA, specifically coming from FAA Human Resources, had a list of special code words they give to the National Black Caucus of federal aviation employees that prospective black employees could include in their resume in order to get preferential treatment in the hiring process. In the subsequent investigation into these practices, court documents showed that black applicants received more points for the weighting of their application if they said their lowest grade in high school was science. This sounds to me like quite literally privileging people who are explicitly worse at the job because they're black. If this rejection of merit in favor of diversity were widespread enough, one telltale sign of it would be that complex interlocking systems in a modern country begin to have a bunch of errors, generally starting off with small ones. Momentum can keep things going for a time, but as the old merit hires die off or retire out of the system, the new diversity hires actually can't keep up, aka the competency crisis. If the focus on diversity continues, you can expect to see two further effects. One, the political empowerment of the coalition doing the diversifying, as the diversity hires know that they wouldn't have gotten to where they are without the help of their new friends up top, and so they become loyal to the new regime. And two, the whole civilization enters into a period of slow-motion collapse that will take decades to fully resolve. Both of these things happened in the Soviet Union as a result of Lenin's coalition building, and rightoids believe that they're witnessing both of these things happen in the West right now. Do I believe it? I mean, sort of. There is some circumstantial evidence that it's happening, though I think the rightoids are massively overstating their case. If it is actually happening exactly as the reactionaries write about in their political theory, I think we're at the very early stages of it, and that the solution to it is still ultimately a liberal one. It means ending nonsense diversity initiatives and returning to colorblind, merit-based hiring practices. What this means, in practical terms, is purging the progressive, fat, blue-haired woke scolds from their middle management positions across all the various institutions, a process which actually has begun in the past couple months, with events like the layoffs in tech or the rolling back of the ESG stuff. I'm actually pretty hopeful about the solution to this problem working out, though it will take some time. By the way, the socialists have their own view of this problem, and it's just straight up inferior to the right-wing conceptualization of it. They call it late-stage capitalism, referring back to Marx's idea that the political development of history is linear and that it has a predictive element to it. The idea is that as capitalism degrades and revolution starts to come forth, we'll begin to see various signs of it, meaning the signs of late-stage capitalism. A lot of the time, the whole late-stage capitalism thing is just a dumb meme, with the person evoking it either saying nothing of substance at all, or failing to recognize that they directly play a part in their own commodification. But this take went viral a couple of days ago, and I think it really puts a stake in the socialist whole view of this problem. I once asked a guy his worst fear, and he said the slow decline of capitalism around us, causing every piece of infrastructure to fail or collapse, but it happens so slowly no one notices or stops it in time. And that's now my worst fear too. This person is blaming the competency crisis on capitalism, like it's just a natural part of the capitalist mode of production that things will decay. This is just wrong, for two reasons. 1. Everything decays no matter what. Entropy isn't a force that's unique to one specific politics or something. 2. The cause of the competency crisis is rejecting merit in favor of diversity. Infrastructure is slowly failing or collapsing, not because it's capitalist infrastructure, but because instead of hiring the best people to maintain the infrastructure, progressive morality demands that we hire the brownest, or the gayest, or whatever. That's not to say that you shouldn't hire a brown person or a gay person if they're competent, of course, but merit should be the goal. And where merit and diversity clash, merit should win. Like, just look at the discourse in this idea. A vast amount of anti-DEI folks are absolutely racists. The very idea that a push for diversity somehow ruins applicant quality is in itself blatantly racist. Listen, if you're taking less qualified people specifically for their diverse characteristics, then not only are you a racist yourself, but yes, you're quite literally ruining everything. I'm gonna have to do a video at some point on this idea of late-stage capitalism, as well as DEI, because they're both fucking stupid, but that's a bit too far off topic for today. The main purpose of this video is to explain the competency crisis, and what's underneath it, the people who aren't on the dissident right. Since it's my experience that people who are on the center, and especially people who are on the left, have never really encountered this framework before. When let's say, a less educated rightoid begins to ramble about how gays in the military are destroying the fabric of American society, or how black people flying airplanes are causing air travel to be more unsafe, your average leftoid looks at him and thinks he's a conspiracy-brained retard, and in my opinion, quite correctly. But there is more under the hood of these ideas, even if your average rightoid doesn't quite know how to articulate it. But now you do. You know what's under the hood. You know what their political theory is. You know its pros and cons. You know the instances where it may be correct, and it's also pretty easy to tell when it's not. And now that you know, you can advocate for solving the legitimate problems that the right is pointing at without accepting their wacky prescriptions of returning to monarchy or having a dictatorship or some other weird shit like that. And that about does it for me, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. This one absolutely took a lot of work to do. I mentioned at the start that I have a Discord server up now. I did have one before, but that one shut down a while ago. This is a new one. And here's basically how it's going to work. Anyone can join it, but really the main way to access the whole server is through donations. Yes, it's not a full dono-only server. It is like a 90% dono-only server. I had to do this, honestly, because the last server just had way too many shitheels coming in and ruining it for everyone. It's unfortunate, but that's just the state of things. So if you want to join the server, it's discord.gg/SFO, link in the description. Additionally, if you give $5 a month on Patreon, Subscribestar, the YouTube memberships program, or the Twitch sub program, you have access to the whole server. Now that is $5 a month. So there's also an option where if you give $100 USD directly to my PayPal, you get lifetime membership. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you next time. Have a good one, guys. I love you.